Well, was it the rabbi?
Okay,
Was it the rabbi who fell asleep?
this is live. We are live.
I used to get in my previous community. I used to get complaints from people on Shabbos morning if I didn't speak long enough. They didn't get long enough shluff. So, you know, I always say to people, if you can concentrate better with your eyes closed, feel free. I'm not offended. I'm not offended.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us at the Rabbinic Chavrusa in memory of Rabbi Lord Sachs. This is a monthly gathering that we have, and I've been learning with rabbis across Anglo-Jewry, and it's such an honor and pleasure this evening to be in conversation with Rabbi Alex Chapper. Rabbi Chapper is the senior minister at Bournemouth and Elstree Synagogue, and Rabbi Chapper is no stranger to HGSS, formerly youth director many years ago, and so really a welcome back to Rabbi Chapper.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Friedman. It's lovely to be back.
Lovely to be back. Fabulous. You haven't changed a bit.
Thank you. Yes, I haven't aged at all. Thank you.
So tonight we're going to be talking about Rabbi Sachs's work, Future Tense. And, well, let's start with this. Before we even get to the book, Rabbi Chapper, I think this is quite unique in our Rabbinic Chavrusa. I don't think I've experienced this before, but Rabbi Chapper, you are actually a musmach. You received your ordination from Rabbi Sachs. So tell us a little about your own Rabbi Sachs journey.
That's right. Firstly, thank you for having me. It's really lovely to be, as I said, lovely to be back here in this community, and to say to you and your Rebbetzin, together with Good Times, have been doing amazing work during this crazy last year. And also, your daughter just graduated as well.
Thank you.
Really lovely. Yeah, interestingly, part of my connection with the late Rabbi Lord Sachs was actually in this community. Very fond memories, because my wife and I, Eva, were married in this community, in the shul here, and we were honoured that the chief rabbi actually read the Kesubah here. So that's part of my connection to him. But also, yes, I got my smicha from what was Jews College, now LSJS. And chief rabbi at the time was principal of the college, and he was part of the group of rabbis who gave me my smicha.
Fabulous. So, I mean, did he teach you at all?
He did some practical rabbinics courses, which were fascinating to hear his take on how you interact with other people in the community. That was a real insight. It was a real privilege to hear his insights into things.
Give us something. Something stand out. I know you told me earlier today. I feel like I'm underdressed. What did he?
Oh, I do remember. Yes, we were very young, pre-smicha students. There was a group of us in the room, and I remember Rabbi Sachs saying something about, that people expect certain things of rabbonim, and one of the things is that a rabbi should always be dressed as a rabbi. And one thing he said was that a rabbi should always wear a white shirt. I never forgot that, because three of them in the room at that time were wearing blue shirts. So it was quite a little bit awkward, but it's something that stuck in my memory.
Look, it could have been worse. It could have been pink polka dots.
Well, yeah, absolutely, yes. So yes, I went home and quickly threw out all of my blue shirts. Never wore blue shirts ever again, except when I'm on holiday. In fact, it's very funny. When I do wear a different shirt to the one I normally wear, my children say, "What's wrong with you? Are we on holiday or something?" But yeah, I mean, every encounter with the chief rabbi, particularly when you heard him speak at rabbinic conferences, and whenever you had an opportunity to speak, literally, it reminds me of the words of Chazal. Like, you literally sit at his feet and soak up those words. And it wasn't just what he said; it was just the way he said it. He just had this way of drawing you in, and his erudition and his scholarship was just phenomenal. It's just awe-inspiring, really.
Right.
And I remain in awe of him. And so thank you to you for actually asking me to have an opportunity to reread one of his books, because literally just from the first few pages, it's just awestruck by just the phenomenal way that he has with words. I don't think there's any word in this book, like in any of his books, that's actually wasted or superfluous. Every single word is an absolute gem, and it's just priceless.
Absolutely, yeah. So, why did you choose Future Tense?
It's a good question. Firstly, I think that the title, again, just is genius. It's so clever, so that it has the double meaning of the future tense, what's happening obviously in the future, and the thrust of the book, which is this tension that there is for the future of the Jewish people, and his genuine love for the Jewish people and concern for the future of the Jewish people, and being able, and I don't know who coined the phrase, but I think I remember the Lord Sachs himself saying, "I'm not a prophet, I'm a rabbi." But I think some of the things he said were fairly prophetic, but in the mold of prophets, in that being able to speak to the age, being able to call out at modern times, be able to say, "This is the things we need to address." And he didn't just say them; he actually put his money where his mouth was. He got on and did it. And so that's why I think this book is so powerful. So many of the things in here, with all of his writings, but particularly some of the things in here, really, really resonate with me. And I think it's a phenomenal book. I recommend it to everybody who hasn't read it.
I mean, you say that he was a rabbi, not a prophet, but I think that there's some kind of prophecy going on, I don't know, backdoor prophecy between you and he, Exile. I mean, you read these things, it's like he wrote it for this week.
Yes, well, I've read that, which chapter is it? 9, is it, I think?
Yeah, I think 4, 5 and 6, I'll be mentioning them.
Yeah, so literally just talking about what was happening in 2009.
Yes.
Yeah. You could have just changed the dates and it would have happened, unfortunately, a few weeks ago. Just that correlation between events in the Middle East and, sadly, the rise in anti-Semitism that we've all experienced in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
It's just, the cyclical nature of time is just so incredible.
Yeah, well, let's get right into it. So I think what we'll do this evening is we will go through a number of the chapters. We'll each speak about a chapter and then discuss it between us. And then we'll open up to our audience if there are any questions. Thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us this evening. Such a pleasure and honor to have you here. I know we have representation really from both Boreham Wood and the suburb. And it's, I would say, just as far afield really as South Africa. So this is very exciting this evening to see you all here, and thank you for joining us. All right, so I will start with chapter 2. Chapter 2 is entitled, "Is There Still a Jewish People?" And Rabbi Sachs, in this chapter, he identifies, we often think about the destruction of the Second Temple as being on account of sinas chinam, baseless hatred. But he says really all of our exiles, if you think about them, are rooted in sinas chinam. He starts with the first one. What's our first exile? Into Egypt. That began with the hatred between the brothers. Joseph and his brothers, we descend to Egypt. That's our first exile as a people. The next one we finally make it to the Promised Land. We have a first temple, and then the temple is later destroyed. But he says the beginning of the end happens at the division of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Following the death of Shlomo Melech, his son tries to take over, but is poorly advised, and there is a revolt or a breakaway in the north, and that eventually leads to two separate countries, two separate, I don't want to say nation states, but states, and ultimately the breakdown and exile, the 10 lost tribes of the northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom. So again, sinas chinam, this baseless hatred that leads to the exile. And then, of course, the second temple, which is the third exile, on account of various factions that existed just in Jerusalem alone at the time. Factions between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Sicarii. Over and over again, we have all of these groups that are the infighting that he says is the source of the exile. So here's his conclusion, very powerful. He says, over thousands of years, nations, peoples, armies have tried to destroy us. He says the only nation who can threaten the future of the Jewish people is the Jewish people. And that is the basis of his thesis here in the book, to be able to say, well, wait a sec, what are we doing wrong? Where are we losing? And what can we do to mend the rift that we have created? He brings up a theme that is a recurring theme he often alludes to, the theme of Am and Ada. Are we good with, is our live stream working? Am and Ada. He says that we are, on the one hand, we are a people, the Jewish people, and on the other hand, we are an assembly, a faith group. And sometimes those things are emphasized one way, sometimes they're emphasized another way. He also similarly calls it fate versus faith of the Jewish people. Am I a Jew by fate? No. Happen to be born into a Jewish family, or faith because I believe in the Jewish creed. He says, in fact, we ask a potential convert these two questions. A, do you want to be part of this people who've experienced quite our fair share of persecution? And secondly, are you prepared to abide by halacha? So faith and fate, fate and faith. He says that Rav Soloveitchik would call this Brit Goral and Brit Ye'ud. Sometimes it's just luck of the draw, who I was born to, and then my choices of the faith, religious choices that I make. Now, he says, look into the Torah and look at the length of the blessings versus the curses. The blessings, really short, a few psukim, a few verses. Then the curses, the admonition, the tochacha, much longer. Why is that? What's happening here? He says, well, you have to look at some of the key words that our sages have honed in on. One of them says that they will stumble over one another, and from here our sages derive that we are responsible for one another. When we are in this state of confusion, state of chaos, and we see people stumbling, then we have to focus on the one another. And our sages found this idea, which is really the covenantal idea that he focuses on in so much of his writings, and said, when does it really play a huge role? When we are stumbling, when we're cursed, when we're going to exile. At that point, the social covenant, the cohesion, has to really take hold, because we're not going to have a land anymore that's going to keep us together. It's going to be 2,000 years of exile, and unless we can be responsible for one another, we're not going to make it. He says, therefore, collective responsibility begins in exile, but now, where he'll go further in the book, is how do we bring that back now that we no longer are completely in exile? Rabbi Schaffer.
Yes, it's difficult reading that chapter, really, because it really hits home that I think we often think that the greatest weakness the Jewish people have is the external threat. How? Because we're a tiny people, and we have this tiny land, and it's surrounded by these great superpowers, and we don't really have that. That's a weakness, structural weakness within us. And he talks later on about the idea of Greek tragedy, and he says that's not the Jewish story whatsoever, but this is actually the greatest tragedy. When you think about it, the most damage we've done to ourselves is, well, the most damage that's ever happened to us is that what we've self-inflicted. And I actually highlighted that line you quoted, that the only people capable of threatening the future of the Jewish people are the Jewish people. And that's really, it's really powerful and really hard-hitting. And particularly as a communal rabbi, it really speaks to, what we're trying to achieve in trying the idea of, said like an Am and Ada, we talk about kahal, kihila. It's about binding people. I always say, you look at a kihila, a community, if you want to know that God has got a sense of humor, just have to look at Jewish communities. Because we're hardwired not to get on with each other. As he talks later on, we're stiff-necked people. We can't agree on anything. That's just part of our national makeup. And he talks about why that has to be. Sometimes in order to protect your identity, you have to be stiff-necked. But that's when you're dispersed and in exile. When you're in your own homeland and you're together, we should really, those things that bind us together should be greater than those things that divide us. And so I said, if you want to know that God's got a sense of humor, it's that he forces us to come to kehilot, to make a kehilot. There are certain things you can only do as part of a kehillah. There are things you can achieve with that you can't as an individual, and we're meant to be part of a kehillah. Rav Amar Hadros Melech, we talk about, that God himself is glorified when we come together as people.
Which is, of course, right now is a shout out to come back to shul, to leave those tents and those gardens, and we would love to see you back. Did I mention that Rabbi Chapper is the rabbi of, is it the largest congregation in Europe? Oh, we're not in Europe anymore, are we? In the continent of Europe. At least certainly the largest congregation in the UK. And
we don't count Jews. It's all about the souls.
But we do want to see everybody back in our shuls.
Never miss an opportunity. That's yeah, so I think that's really, really powerful, really, really hard hitting, and it reminds me also, the story of when the Jewish people came out of Egypt and they were wandering in the desert, and the first nation to attack them was Amalek. And the Torah says, who did he attack? He attacks those who are ayef ve'ageh, those who are tired and weak, those ones straggling in the back. And that always resonates with me in the idea that the Torah is sending a message to us that the Jewish people themselves were slightly held accountable, should have been held accountable for that, because we should be looking out for the people at the back, those who are weak and straggling, and carrying them with us and making sure they were the ones who were protected. And although Amalek, obviously we know that Amalek is the eternal foe of the Jewish people, for us also that's a lesson for us that we always have to be looking out. We're only as strong as our weakest part of the chain. And coming back to what you said also, the idea about, again, the Lord Sachs talks about it, the idea that Bereshit, the story of the creation of the world, only takes up a few verses in the totality of Tanakh, whereas talking about making the Mishkan a place where God can dwell in this world takes up so much more. And then the idea is that it's easy for God to make a place for us, but it's much harder for us to make a place for God. And I think even more so that it's hard for us to actually find ways that we can live together with each other. And that really is so powerful and such a salutary lesson for us that our strength comes when we're united. Our weakness is when we're disparate and we can't get on with each other. Right. That's a really powerful lesson for us all.
Yeah. So chapter 3?
Yes. So chapter 3, which is what really is where it starts to get really, really interesting, because it's about Jewish continuity and how to achieve it. And again, as a communal rabbi, I think it's really something that speaks to us, that we're interested about how can we not only inspire this generation, but the next generation as well, to ensure that there is a future for the Jewish people, as the argument that Rabbi Sachs makes so powerfully in here. And he says, throughout history, there have been pretty much two options about how to ensure the Jewish future, how to achieve Jewish continuity. The first is isolation, that in order to protect ourselves, we have to separate from the surrounding cultures, particularly when we're in exile, in order that we maintain our own identity and we don't assimilate. And the other is the complete opposite, which is assimilation. And we see that throughout history, particularly in the Enlightenment period, where that was the first opportunity that Jews had to integrate into society. And that's where you see the two great opposing reactions to that, which was, let's grab it with both hands. And he talks about, Moses Mendelssohn, he talks about how trying to show that Judaism actually is compatible with the modern world, and those things which aren't necessarily that easy to fit in can be gently dropped. That's not how Orthodoxy sees it, but that's how the Reform movement began. And the other reaction to it, which is to become more isolationist and introverted and say, we're actually going to strengthen our identity. We are going to remove ourselves from modern society and live within an enclave. He talks about building our own ghettos. The Jews were forced into ghettos, and now Jews have chosen to create their own ghettos as a way of protection. He says neither ways are sustainable. Obviously, the first way he talks about assimilation obviously is not sustainable and he talks about the figures again, frightening figures. And you come from the continent where those numbers are just off the scale. Here, they talk about we're about 5 or 10 years behind America. So it always takes us time to catch up. Hopefully, we don't catch up with that statistic, but the numbers are frightening. The numbers are worrying. And even not necessarily on such a dramatic scale. But we look at, I remember when I was growing up. I'm going to Shul on Yom Kippur, and I remember there was an elderly man sitting near where we used to sit, and every year we sat in the same place, and he sat in the same place, which is again a peculiarity. I'm not sure if we have that in the other side of the continent, but everyone has a particular space they all sit in, and they won't move from that. And I would see that he would be there from the beginning of the service. Partway through the service, his adult son would turn up, and then much later on in the service, the grandson would turn up. And that really was such a powerful depiction of how what we call the Yurids Hadoros, like how each generation would be slightly less connected and involved than the previous one. And then as the years went on, again the son would arrive probably a bit later than each year than he did, and then one year, tragically, the grandson just never turned up. Now, it may have been that he went somewhere else, and whatever.
He comes here now.
He went to much frummer shul than that. Who knows? Like me and we being pessimistic. Let's always be optimistic. Maybe that he was going to his in-laws. Who knows? But it could be that it's such a clear how that's the real challenge for us, and that's the danger, obviously, of assimilation, where and again, Rabbi Sachs talks about it a lot. He says, the non-Jewish world respects Jews who respect Judaism. They don't have any respect for Jews who don't respect Judaism, and that's a challenge. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people think they're embarrassed of being Jewish. They don't want to show it openly. And again, there's so many different cultures and religions in the world now, and there's so many different people who wear it on their faces and they can't hide from it. But also are quite proud of their religion and their culture, and are very open about it, and their lifestyles as well. Why should we be ashamed of it? I'm sure we've all only experienced people who have been fascinated to know about our culture and about our religion, and have been proud to know that we're proud of our religion. But actually, that's a bit of a curse that we live with. So that's assimilation. Obviously, not going to work. Isolation, he also says, is not going to work either, because he talks about and I was going to talk about this a bit later, but this idea of Bilam's bracha, his blessing to us, which actually is a curse, when he talks about that we are the people who dwell alone. And this idea that, yes, to protect ourselves, it might make sense on paper to just separate ourselves from the rest of the surrounding culture, but that's not necessarily going to work, because we'll talk about that a bit later on. He said there is a third way, which is what we want to get onto. He said the third way is commitment. If we become more committed to our religion and our faith, then that is the greatest protection for our future, and it's what it ensures Jewish continuity. And he talks about the idea that we value those things that cost us the most. And he says, fascinatingly, counterintuitively, if you think about it, it's the hardest parts of Judaism that are the most observed parts of Judaism. And he talks about this survey between the survey done about Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. That which of those three is the easiest to keep? It's the one that just went, really. Shavuot, what do you have to do? Not very much. Eat cheesecake. I mean, I'm going to admit, as a rabbi, I don't eat cheesecake or children, but
especially not together.
Well, definitely not together. Definitely not together. But how difficult is that? There's Shavuot, which actually celebrates Matan Torah, the actual receiving of the very thing which makes us Jewish, is a very simple festival. It's a very enjoyable festival. There's not much demand on us. Sukkot, you have to leave your home. In this country, not a particularly good time of year to leave your home. You have to start doing DIY. Again, I have my hands up. I'm not very good at DIY. I'm sure most Jewish men aren't very good at it either. But people more, taking a little of an etrog. And then finally, Pesach. Pesach has got to be the hardest chag that we have. Physically demanding, financially demanding, and yet, statistically, it is the most widely celebrated of all the chagim. And I think that's why, the Torah talks about it. The Torah talks about that a person who transgresses Pesach faces the severest penalty. Why? Because there's something about identifying. There's something about saying, when you celebrate Pesach, you're saying, I identify as part of the Jewish people. I'm in the club. Whatever I do the rest of the year is almost immaterial. But that's the minimum you have to do, is identify as part of the club. But why choose that one? And he talks about Yom Kippur again. Most rabbis, I'm sure every rabbi would say, if you're going to pick one day a year to come to shul, don't come on Yom Kippur. It's not the day you can judge Judaism about. In fact, it's the exception that proves the rule. Yom Kippur is a day that's meant to be difficult. It's the only day the Torah says, you have to afflict yourself. It has to be hard. And I always say to people, if the rest of your Jewish experience is as hard as Yom Kippur, you're just doing it wrong. Because it's not meant to be. It's meant to be about joy. It's meant to be about simcha sachayim, the enjoyment of life. And Judaism is about to be about enjoying life and getting the most out of it. If your Jewish experience is like Yom Kippur, you've missed the point. And yet, the majority of Jews focus on Pesach and Yom Kippur. Why, he says? For very positive reasons. He says because we recognize that what's difficult is valuable. What we have to work hard at means the most to us. And then again, we see that in all walks of life. I tell my own children, they don't know none of them. When it comes to schoolwork, it's not fun. It's hard. It's a hard slog. But why do you do it? Because the more work you put into it, the more you'll value what you get out of it. If it just comes easily, someone who comes easily to them, they don't particularly value what they've achieved. But if they've had to work at it, the things and we can all resonate that, what we've had to work hard at means the most to us. And that's what Rabbi Sachs is saying, that the key to Jewish continuity is commitment and greater commitment. The more we work at our Judaism, the more we will value our Judaism, and the more likely it is we'll pass on that love and that the more we invest of ourselves in something else, the more we love that other thing. So the more we invest of ourselves in our Judaism, the more we'll love it, and we'll be able to pass that on to the future generations. And then the final thing he says this idea that Judaism makes great demands of us. The obvious question is, if God wanted to reward us, if he wanted to give us the good he does want to give us, just give us one mitzvah. And if we fulfill that mitzvah, then he'll give us the reward we can have, and we can, the rest of the time to ourselves, right? Now, there's an obvious answer why that doesn't work. And that's go back to the beginning of time. Adam HaRishon, the first human being, was given one mitzvah. And it wasn't even have to do something, it was just don't do something. Just don't eat from that tree for a few hours before Shabbat, and it'll be Shabbat for the rest of your life. Gan Eden for whole. He failed at that, and it was game over. Paradise lost, and so we see that doesn't work. Although intuitively you might think, just give us a few mitzvahs and we'll do those and we'll be good. Truth is, as we say, that God, out of his great love for us, wants to benefit us. So if he gives us a large body of Torah and mitzvahs, why? Because we have 630 mitzvahs. Why? Because in case we fail at some, there are at least others that we'll be able to do. So God wants us to succeed. He says Judaism makes great demands on us, and those great demands make us great. And I think that's such a powerful argument, and so inspiring and uplifting. We should be shouting that from the rooftops.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this notion that he talks about, that you get in what you put out, but I think he's also, on the one hand, he talks about Yom Kippur as being something that we're invested in, but like you said, there's also that fine line between the investing and also not only picking the unpleasant parts. He talks about the Holocaust. He says, we talk so much, we tell our children so much about the Holocaust, and that becomes their entire Judaism. I mean, I'll read you a line. He says, children will grow up knowing about the Greeks and how they lived, the Romans and how they lived, the Jews and how they died. And if that's the message we're giving, it's really problematic. I mean, he talks about other ideas here also when he says, sometimes we think that we can expose our children to Jewish culture, and so by some kind of osmosis, that's going to make them Jewish. But this is brilliant. He says, I love Greek philosophy, the French Impressionists, Italian design, and the serene beauty of a Japanese garden. But that does not make me Greek, French, Italian, or Japanese. You do not have to be Jewish to enjoy Jewish humor, klezmer music, or chicken soup with noodles. Culture involves no act of commitment. Again, so powerful when we have this idea that, like you say, there needs to be a serious commitment of time and effort, and that commitment of time and effort needs to be one that's not in such a way that will be resented because it's only the difficult, challenging part of it. It needs to be something that we're investing in and reaping the rewards and benefits and enjoyment in this world too. And when we do that, then we can, in his words,
he's saying it has to be substantive rather than passive. It has to be things which are not necessarily unpleasant, but challenging, because it's that sense of achievement when we value it. And you're right, that being passive and just sitting back and eating a bagel doesn't make you Jewish. It won't secure the Jewish future.
Right. So I think you're going right into chapter 4.
Yeah. So chapter 4 is also a very, 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 very powerful chapter.
Are you going to take questions?
Is that a question?
Are there questions on the?
Should I put it down?
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I add something?
Okay, I'm going to have to repeat what you're saying because.
But maybe just you remember where you took a trip to Israel and you took the kids to all the burial sites, and then there was a sign in the Haria. You want to tell that story?
What was the sign?
No, you shouldn't come to Israel just to see the grave sites of Tzaddikim, but you have to also see the beautiful.
That was the sign.
It's like come to do a boat ride on the Kinneret.
Right. So Rabbinit is here in the audience, and she has reminded me of a trip that we took to Israel, and we thought, here we are taking our children around the Kvarim up north, to get to see all the wonderful tourist sites of all the dead rabbis. And then we thought, is this the Israel we want our kids to remember? Right. They went to see a bunch of dead rabbis. And then we saw a sign that said, go on a boat ride on the Kinneret, and we thought, let's do that as well, because that's just as important in terms of their memories of Israel and their knowledge of Israel and their feelings about Israel. It's a live country, not just a country of the past.
I had the same feelings about trips to Poland, taking people to see the concentration camps. I felt that for a lot of people, personally, I felt that would only be generate negative emotions. That doesn't inspire me to be more Jewish because and he talks about not handing Hitler the 614th mitzvah is not to hand Hitler the posthumous victory that we assimilate and lose our religion. But I always felt, and this is a very personal thing, that I felt that I didn't want people to their identity should be based on the fact that we have to live because they died. I have to say now, I have taken a number of communal groups on there, and I've been converted to it because it can be transformative moments. If you then emphasize not just all the negative stuff, this is how we died, this is what they did to us, that could be very just negative and not have the desired effect. But actually, this takes the expert of the guide to be able to do this, actually to remind us of what's really important in life and what it means to be Jewish and how we should live as Jews rather than and not focus on those who died as Jews, but how we can live as Jews. So I think it's exactly the same idea.
Yeah, I wasn't really personally either sold on the idea until one day I heard the story of my grandfather, Oliver Shalom, who grew up in York. Now, weren't a lot of Jews in York, but his father had hopped off the boat from Russia and moved to York. There was a Jewish community there. There was an Orthodox shul there for many years. But he didn't grow up with a solid Jewish education, shall we say. And he was in the British Army and went into the camps after the Holocaust. And it was at that moment, looking around, that something lit up inside of him, and he said, these people died for a reason. They died for something because their Judaism meant something. Whether obviously it wasn't their choice, but at that point he was inspired right then and there to discover his Judaism, and he moved to Sunderland, which was a thriving community at the time. Married my grandmother, and became a lot more committed to his Judaism. Chapter 4.
Chapter 4. So the chapter 4 is called The Other, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. And obviously Rabbi Sachs goes through a scholarly examination of where the differences between Judaism, Christianity and Islam are, and where the tension lines, where the fault lines, and why that's caused issues for us for centuries. I don't really want to focus on that necessarily. I want to say this idea that Rabbi Sachs talks about a lot, and I remember him hearing him a lot talking about this idea of the other, and how the Jewish people represent the other, and that's why we are a minority. That's why Israel is a tiny country amongst others, because we represent this idea this idea of otherness, and how important that is. And he talks about this difference between universalism and particularism. That God is universal. If he goes back to the beginnings of the Torah, you see that God creates the entire universe. He speaks to the first human beings who weren't Jewish. Noah wasn't Jewish. The very first Jew was obviously the monotheistic recognition was through Abraham. But up to that point, God was speaking universally. So the truths that God in part brings to the world are universal. They apply to everybody. That God is the God of everybody. However, Judaism is particular. It's a religion that's only for the Jews. Now, that doesn't mean that we see ourselves as elite or special and different in any way, that we look down on the other religions, although they have issues with us because they see that they've moved on from us. However, we don't see it in that way. We see it that Judaism is the path to God for Jews, Those other religions are the path to God for people who are adherents to those other religions. We have no issue with that. That's why we're not proselytizing religion, because we believe that there are many paths to God. What's right for us is not necessarily right for other people. And he talks about, fascinatingly, how the Jewish journey itself, you look at it, talking about Abraham, the Jewish journey actually starts in reverse to all other journeys. All other journeys of nationhood start small, start with weakness, and end up with strength. Abraham starts in Mesopotamia, which was a superpower of the time, and was told, leave that all behind and travel to this unknown land, which I promise you. The Jewish people also were taken out of Egypt, which was the recognized superpower of its time, and again taken through the desert and taken again to this promised land, the tiny little country. It's a Jewish journey is that in reverse, and that is in order that we understand that it's not about between power and right. That's not what it's all about. He said it's all about respect. He talks about this idea that we're all created B'Tselem Elokim. They're all created in God's image. All of us, regardless of religion or nothing, we are all in God's image. However, we are all different. That to be in God's image means you have the freedom to be God. That's how He created us, to be completely different from each other. And I think he says it's a beautiful line. He says, if we were all the same, we'd have nothing to talk about. If we agreed on everything, there would be no conversation. I think he talks about it a bit later on. But then he talks about this idea, which obviously he wrote in another book called The Dignity of Difference, which resonates so powerfully for me. And I know we've all been asked to write an essay on for the chief rabbis for a memorial book for Rabbi Sachs, and that's what I actually wrote on, The Dignity of Difference, because it really powerfully resonates with him, because he talks about the idea that we have to make space for others in this world. That's our mission here in this world. The Jewish mission is to teach that we have to respect others who are different to us. And this idea of the dignity of difference, which is that's based on the fact that nobody in this world has a monopoly on truth. Ultimate truth is in heaven. God has ultimate truth. It's universal, but we all have our own particular truths. So, and I find the analogy very powerful, which is, you go to an art gallery and two people can be standing side by side looking at the same piece of work, and then they talk to each other and say, what did you see? What did you think about it? And they both say completely different things. Now, who's right? They're both right, because it's perspective. And you talk about it being a zero-sum game, that two people can say exactly opposite things, and yet both can be right. Now, that's not difficult if you can respect the other. And that's really what we're here to do. And he talks about this beautiful idea that the requirement to love the stranger is mentioned 36 times in the Torah. And I don't think that's the significance of that. I think is double high. Twice 18. If you want to know what life is, it's about being able to love somebody who's completely different from you, who may challenge you, who may see the world completely differently to you, but be able to live side by side in dignity and respect. He goes on to talk about, we'll talk about maybe a little later, the idea that, we have within the Jewish world itself, we have to learn that as well. There are many different voices. As I said, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We can't agree on anything, and that's why I said it's about the divine comedy. But the message for the world is that's what we convey, that we are always meant to be a small people. Our journey is always meant to be the opposite direction, to show it's not about power or might. It's about allowing other people to be right and of respecting that. I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, you did mention the dignity of difference, and I think just to fine-tune a little, because I think this is maybe where Rabbi Sachs got into little hot water between version 1 and version 2, is when we say that there are various paths to salvation, to godliness, to spirituality, to heaven. I think that the normative way of thinking about that is that there is Judaism, which is our particularist way of thinking about it, and the universalist way is not that Rabbi Sachs would have said that that the alternative religions are acceptable from a Jewish perspective, at least not in the formula for the second version. I think that the formula would be that monotheism without 613 commandments, aka Noahidism, that would be the alternative universalistic path. I'm not entirely sure that the alternative formula is completely contraband. I mean, certainly even in the Rambam talks about the reason Jesus had to come to the world was in order to create a knowledge of Mashiach. Rav Yaakov Emden talks about that, and he suggests that maybe Jesus originally was just teaching people the Noahide laws, and it somehow molded into a Ten Commandments idea, and then
Judaism light, that sort of thing.
Right, and took its own, grew legs and went way beyond. But I think that we do still need to be careful, because these ideas can be taken out of context. So we just want to make sure that it's really just a particularist Judaism versus a universalist monotheism, Noahidism, and encourage people. The other, and that's probably a reason that Rav Soloveitchik and others weren't so in favor of interfaith dialogue. Interfaith activism and working together and loving one another and tolerating one another, respecting one another, respecting the other, promoting the other is important. But when we get into dialogue about the faith dialogue itself, it gets complicated, because then it does become more than just different perspectives, but different competing truths, because either there's unity or there's Trinity, and the best that we can do from our perspective is somehow exonerate, let's say, Christianity, and say, well, it's not really Trinity. They might call it Trinity, but we really believe that it's a form of, for them it's okay. So, and it's a little technical, but it's.
I think what I was trying to say is, firstly, I appreciate trying to save my career here now, and Lord Rabbi Sachs doesn't need me to defend him. I just say some of the ideas resonate with me. I mean, we can almost take religion out of the picture, and you can take even politics out of the picture. It's the core idea is to be able to have a dignity of distance, to respect people whose views, whatever they are, whether they're religious or political, whatever it is, differ from ours. And that works within the Jewish community as well. I think that's so powerful that we have to learn to be able to get on with people. That's the first and foremost thing. We see, as come back to what we said about the beginning, that all the tragedies that have happened because people couldn't get on with each other. Cain and Abel, the first two, couldn't get on with each other. And then Joseph and his brother, they couldn't speak b'shalom with each other, peacefully with each other. And what happened? That's I think that is the core message for us all. That for humanity, really, to be able to respect each other, to recognise we all have godliness within us, to respect that bit, even if we disagree with everything else that goes with it.
Right. I mean, I absolutely. I think one of the things that I struggle with in reading Rabbi Sachs, particularly here, but also elsewhere, but I think it's really emphasized here, is there's almost an equalization. Let's go back to his end of the Second Temple period, where he talks about disputes between Sadducees and Pharisees and Essenes and Hillel and Shammai, and I don't know what to do with that. I mean, you put it all into the same mix, but I'm not sure that we necessarily believe that it's all in the same mix. When he talks about arguments for the sake of heaven, I think that as well we need to be careful. Certainly in other parts of the book, I'm astounded by his level of boldness when he, I mean, the way he talks about Reform Judaism, I think it's very courageous of him, and not necessarily a bridge-building initiative. But so I don't think that he's in any way trying to see things through rose-colored glasses. I think he's honest with where things are at. But I think in this regard, I think we just, it's not so clear to me, unless you can clarify for me, where he would draw the line. Certainly says we need to listen, but he says listening means that I don't have my foregone conclusion. But I would assume, as an Orthodox rabbi, that I do know what my foregone conclusion is. I can listen all I like, but I'm never planning to accept Jesus. I can listen all I like, but my Orthodox Judaism is the Judaism that I'm going to.
So I don't want to disagree with you here, but I didn't hear that. I didn't get that from it. I got the fact that
Disagree, that's what we're here for.
yeah,
We're
exactly.
meant to argue, and
I still respect you. I respect your opinion. My opinion might not change. Your opinion might not change. We can have.
I'm happy to change my opinion.
No, I'm not trying to change your opinion. But
That's what we're here for. That's what he says. We need to change our
I'm
opinion.
leaving. I think what he goes on to say is that the argument, he said, L'shem Shemaim, for the sake of heaven, is healthy. He said, you learn more about yourself. By challenging yourself, by having your principles and ideals challenged by somebody else, doesn't mean they're going to convert you to their position or you're going to come and respect their position, but it actually reinforces your own position.
Right.
But what he's saying is at the same time, he says that therefore that's healthy, but he's saying at the same time you always have to maintain respect. That I'm going to disagree with you, I'm never going to agree with you, but I'm always going to respect you. And then he talks about why, the beautiful Gemara that says that why was Hillel's teachings accepted more than Shammai's? Because Hillel first put Shammai's teachings before himself, always quoted him first, and he respected him, and they married between each other to show that and that amazing that Baskol says that Elu ve'elu tivei Elokim Chaim, that these and these words are both God's words, meaning you can both be right and you can both have God on your side. But when it comes to finding a path, we have to have rules how that works. So there's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser, but you have to shake hands at the end of the day, and that's fine. And he talks about when you're sitting down, and again, the other Gemara says even when a father and son are sitting down learning together, they should be enemies with each other. But when they get up from each other, they should be peace. They should be brothers again, or fathers and sons again. Why? Because you're going through an intellectual exercise, and yes, you're fighting your corner, and you want to win. But why are you wanting to win? To defeat the other person? No, that's not right. You want to win because you will gain from that because you will have expressed your thoughts and your ideas, had them challenged and yet defended them, and that will reinforce them for you. You haven't imposed them on somebody else. You haven't changed their mind, but you've reinforced it for you, and therefore it more powerfully speaks to you than it did previously.
Certainly, and I think in his later books, certainly his most recent, his final book, Morality, he decries what becomes known, it's not called that in 2009 when he writes this one, but cancel culture, where, I don't like the other person's opinion, so I'm not going to, so that's it, I'm not having a conversation.
Yeah, that's just like flipping the table, isn't it? I don't know how it's going, so just flip the table, but that's not mature, and that doesn't get anywhere, and that's not respectful either.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
So we have my Asa Conegdo from the audience here has suggested that one's spouse should be, or Eve was created, or given to Adam to be his Azer, his helper Conegdo, against him, in opposition to him. That the way we become the greatest help for our spouse is when we challenge them. And really, like you say, Rabbi Chapper, the more we're challenged, the more we're able to grow in our own thoughts and our own behaviors and our own abilities. I know that hour's getting a little late, so you have the latest chapter in the book, chapter 9. So let's go to that one, because that will bring things a little together.
Okay. So this really sort of ties together everything we've been saying here, actually, because chapter 9 is about the Jewish conversation. Again, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, the Rabbi Sachs goes back again to the biblical account of Bilam attempting to curse the Jewish people, but those curses being turned into blessings. And one of those is Am levadad yishkon. We will be people who dwell apart, alone. Now, brilliantly, he suggests that we think that's actually a blessing. That's saying you'll maintain your identity, you won't be influenced by those around you, you will live in an enclave in your own ghetto. Actually, he says that's a curse. The only blessing that actually was Matov Olecha, how good are your tents. But the Jewish people should live alone is actually a curse for us as part of the world, but also as a people as well, he says. That we need to be able to build relationships. We need to be able to integrate and talk to other people. And that, yes, Jews argue. However, he said that's okay. That's not a bad thing. He said, but that has to be l'shem shemaim. It has to be for the sake of heaven. It has to be for positive reasons, not for constructive reasons, not for destructive reasons. And he says the importance of dialogue, that Judaism is a dialogue, it's not a monologue. It's about people talking to each other. God spoke to us and we speak to others. It's about collaboration.
I think one of the most powerful ideas that struck me when he talks about God asking Avram, or informing Avram, I'm going to destroy Sodom. And Avram starts pleading with God, and at the end of the day, he doesn't win. But he says, Rabbi Sachs says, I mean, God wasn't going to change his mind. God had made up his mind. What was the whole point of it? To show that there's a conversation that takes place. It's still, there is part of the justice is the conversation that takes place. You don't simply, God knows what the conclusion is going to be, but that doesn't mean that he is not answerable and doesn't need to have that conversation and talk it through. That's part of the justice, and the Torah begins. Well, God says to Avram, how can I not tell this to Avram? His job is going to be to impress upon his children the way of justice. And this is the way of justice. Part of it is conversation.
Right. I think even more than that, and again, I heard Rabbi Sachs talk about this a lot, this idea of Avram, and I find it so powerful and resonates so well that God invites that question. Not just a conversation, but a question. Avram is challenging God, and you think, how can Avram says himself, I'm not qualified, I'm just dust and ashes, right? But God invites not only the conversation, but the questioning. He's saying to God, how can you, how can the judge of all earth not do justice? God wants him to ask, because he wants us to try and understand him. And therefore, and he goes, okay, fine, okay, let's do that, go to the basket, but if you can find the righteous people, I won't destroy it. But obviously, eventually, Avram realizes that God is right. And I think it's so powerful. The end of the story it says, Avram, I think he goes back to his place. And I understand this. I've never seen this in any commentaries, but I understand what it means is that Avram accepts, I can't understand. That I'm challenged to try. That's why I have to question God. But ultimately, sometimes you have to accept that you can't. And I think, again, Rabbi Sachs puts this like this, that faith, belief, is that gap between finite human understanding and God. That there's no such thing as a blind faith in Judaism. We're not expected just to say, I believe. But we are expected to accept that, however, and the Rambam talks about this as well, the more we understand God, the more we come to know God, the more connection we have to God, because God is ultimate intellect. But we have to accept. And I think this is also very difficult for Jewish people, particularly because the chutzpah of Jewish people is we think we can understand everything. We should be able to understand it or explain everything. And we don't like things we can't explain as part of the human condition. But Judaism says, yes, question God and challenge God, but you also have to at some point accept that its divine intellect is not the same as the human intellect. My ways are not your ways. And Moshe Rabbeinu goes to the same thing as well. Lama reis lama zeh. Why have done this negative thing to God, to the Jewish people? And God has to explain. Moses says, show me your ways. Let me understand. God says you can only understand with hindsight, you can't understand. But to ask the question, to challenge God, to be angry at what appears to be injustice, again, Rabbi Sachs talks about that a lot. He wants us to be. God wants us to get angry because through anger, through that sense of this is injustice, it motivates you to actually do what we can to rectify that. He said the time is late. He talks about this idea that within Judaism and with the world, there's too much talking, too little listening, which I think is so true. Again, the idea. What is the definition of silence? It's just that interval you're waiting to actually say something while the other person's talking, and we see that in Judaism. And he says how in Western culture we talk a lot about seeing. The understanding and knowledge is about, do you see my point? Do you see what I'm saying? He says in Judaism that's not it. It's not about seeing. It's about hearing. And he says that the first mitzvah, the most important mitzvah is Shema Yisrael, that is Israel hear. It's about listening. And Shema also means to understand, as we know, that only if you're willing to listen to somebody else can you come to understand them, and then better understand yourself, and obviously to understand God.
And I love it how he contrasts that. Our ultimate declaration of faith is the Shema.
Yeah.
He contrasts that with the first sin, where Eve, the Torah says that she saw that the fruit was good, the tree was good. And based on that sight, that's how she acted. Instead of doing the listening, he says throughout, and the Torah and then Talmud, Talmudic literature, come and listen. It's all about listening. That's the verb used when here we are communicating, having a relationship. It's about listening, not about seeing or speaking.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Chapper.
Thank you
for coming to Hampstead Garden Suburb and joining us this evening. This has been fabulous. Lovely conversation. and wishing you and your community only blessing. I know it's been a tough week. Those who didn't see Rabbi Chapper putting out the mezuzahs that were ripped down by the anti-Semites, yasher koach to you for fixing the situation. May that be the beginning of our fixed situation as a people, both here in this country, in the Holy Land, and around the world. And may we only have simchas together.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Actually, interesting. I said to the no, it's not.